You are listening to the Gritty Podcast, where we talk about all things gritty. Welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I'm Brian Call. I got Brad Hunt here with me today. We're going to talk about Tipis. There's been a lot of discussions lately we've seen online where people are saying, can't use Tipis here, wouldn't use them there, can't use floorless, gotta have this type of shelter and this type of shelter for these conditions and so on, which caused us to reflect on all the areas we've gone hunting where we didn't use a teepee, and there aren't any. There are none, and we've been all over the place, so we're going to get into that today. Surprise newsflash, there's really not a place. I confirmed with Lampers earlier this week. Is there a place where we would go hunting hardcore and actually leave the teepee behind?
No.
Now, we do have some other single-man shelters we might bring for certain conditions, but the floorless concept stays the same, and so does the fact that we can use a wood stove, and we rarely leave it behind. But we're going to get into that in a moment, dive in, and kind of just have a quick discussion so we can, share our 2 cents on how we would do it.
Right.
Before we do that, I wanted to give a plug to my friend Jeff Downing. He owns True North Outfitters, and if you go to his website, truenorthoutfitters.net, you can see what he does. And I went up there last year with a friend of mine, Jason, and I got invited. I was kind of not that interested, but I was like, I'm going to go. Went up there and did a bear hunt. And it was an archery bear hunt. He had baited it. I wasn't that keen on going just because of the baited thing. Went up there and I did it, and I'm making a film about it. It's cool.
Yep.
It's really cool. I mean, you're not climbing any mountains or doing anything heroic, but you are getting some giant bears, seeing them like 8 feet from you. That experience alone is intense.
Right.
Observing, there's a lot about bear behavior you get to observe firsthand. It's fun. It's not overly hard except to maintain composure and to make a shot, but the shots are close, set up for success. It is a killer hunt for someone who, like a youth.
Exactly.
Someone that just wants to see bears. So I can't recommend it enough. He's got 3 spots available in 2025 that he hasn't booked yet. They're still available. The dates, I wrote them down, are May 21st to the 26th. There's a bear camp with 3 spots available. Like I said, I think it's worth it. It's great. He said, if you go to his site, you'll see to date, it's 150% success on 2 bears. So you can shoot 2 bears if you want to.
Right.
And it's a 200% opportunity. So the reason it's not a 200% success rate is because guys choke.
Yeah. Right.
Sometimes it's a 12-yard shot and guys miss. If you haven't been around a giant bear like that, it can be a little unnerving for people.
Right.
So anyway, it's an excellent hunt. It's not if you get a bear, really. It's almost like guaranteed.
Yep. And big bears.
And giant bears too. So he's been doing it for a long time. Anyway, I just wanted to help him out, help him get it booked. The prices are very reasonable. So check it out if you're interested. Go to truenorthoutfitters.net and you'll find it there. So let's get into the show, Brad. Where would I use a teepee? Where would I not use a teepee? The truth is, even in areas where we have hunted above timberline, which is one of the main issues I hear often is, hey, you're above timberline. We need a Hilleberg. It's kind of the go-to for a lot of these mountain type hunters that like to do that. We've said this before, even our friends like up at backcountry BC and beyond, I've seen them
suffer
in many ways. And I'm going to get into those ways right now. I've watched a film of them, and they were crossing a river and they didn't have any way to cross it, but their doll sheep were up on this mountaintop, and it's like, well, we got to get these doll.
It's cold weather.
They have no way to cross it, the river. They could take off their boots, strip down to their underwear, and like butt naked, like go across and then get their stuff back on to keep things dry. They made a decision because they were in a hurry to get the sheep and they really didn't want to get away. It seemed like, so they just ran the gauntlet and got wet, got their boots filled up with water, so on. Scarpas.
Yep.
And then they got to the base of the hill, and I can't remember. I think they did climb up there, and I don't remember. I don't know if they got the sheep or not.
I don't remember.
But later, they found themselves with soaking wet boots and clothing, no fire, no stove system, inside a small shelter like a Hilleberg that had no ability to dry out, and super wet boots that were not going to dry out either. And then they spent a couple days there, socked in, cold, and then they made their way out. If you were to contrast that with how we would do it, we might get our boots wet like we did with Chris Tobias. Yep. I've done that multiple times. Ryan and I, when we did our float for moose in Caribou, when we did our grizzly hunt up in Alaska, super wet country, you tried your best but you watch Tobias. He's like, he's an Alaskan. He's like, screw this. I don't have time. He just walks through waist deep, soaking wet. But the reason Chris did that is because we have a big teepee, and I think he was running the 3-man at the time, like bigger than just the 2-man.
Yep.
Big teepee, big stove. I don't remember which one it was. It wasn't the Big Mama, but it was.
No, I think it was the 2XL.
The SXL.
Yep.
And a little titanium stove teepee. The whole thing weighed, I don't know, 3.5 pounds. 4 pounds.
With
4 pounds.
Yeah, pretty much. If you go the bigger teepee, then you're like 5.5, 6 pounds.
Total weight with the stove, pipe, everything. You split that between your buddy, and you're each carrying 2.5 pounds, 2 to 2.5 pounds each.
Yep.
So you're talking about a 2-pound. Let's say it's a 2-man, because we also ran that for sure.
Yep.
2-man. You're less than 4 pounds for your stove and your teepee. And Chris gets soaking wet, throws up that teepee. It's pouring rain. It has been. We can still find wood.
Yeah.
We're our bushcraft is solid. We're able to get a fire raging, and we're able to dry out those boots. And we bring what we call boot dryers, the Graxaw boot dryers.
Yes.
Use the code GRITTY if you get yourself a pair. I was part of helping them be invented in the first place. And those boot dryers are just little tiny fans that hook up to any USB external battery source, right? You get the stove going, so the internal temperature of your teepee is, somewhere around 70 to 80 degrees. Totally cozy. Put your boots on the ground. Let the fans do their thing. They blow that warm air in, and your boots get dry. It's kind of a no-brainer.
Even better if you have a synthetic pair of boots and you put them in the top, and then they're roasty toasty. You don't have to worry about shrinking.
With leather,
you got to worry about shrinking.
You got to worry about it shrinking. And even synthetic, I may not put them in the peak of the teepee.
Yeah,
depends on the hunt. Depends on how hot it is in the teepee.
Right.
But that's the whole point. You can dry out. You can dry out your pants. You can hang them from a clothesline up in there. You can do various things that we've done for years. Be totally dry. So I watched that and I was like, man, and the excuse for not bringing the floorless shelter is, well, we're sheep hunting. And so we're going to be up on this slope and it's deep snow, and we're not going to be able, we need a floor. We need this sort of storm-proof shelter, blah. What that tells me, well, I'm just saying, you know what you know.
Yep, right. Exactly.
And we have proven that that's nonsense.
We kind of debunked that.
In fact, I told Brad, I'm like, we ought to just put up a video that, and I'm going to work on it actually.
No words.
It's just not the priority at the moment. But basically, it just shows all the teepee locations, elevation, temperature, how deep the snow was, how cold it was, and you can just see for yourself everywhere
how
it's
hard
pitched,
the wind's blowing,
how steep the hillside is, how the wind, the storms. Where did we put a teepee? Everywhere. We put a teepee everywhere.
Right.
You know, I put teepee on 5 feet of snow, 10 feet of snow.
Right.
We put our dead man anchors in to which is basically, for those that aren't familiar, you know, when you're pitching on top of snow, because you can't dig down to the ground.
Yep.
We've done both. You kick down to the ground.
Yeah, if you got 10, 12, 14 inches, you can kick down to the ground, get a stake in.
Yeah, clear out the snow. Boom, you're on the ground. Fine. Other places, we're on 10 feet of snow.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, all right, we'll kind of smush it down a little bit, compact it. Then we put the teepee down. We take the stakes. We wrap the lines around it.
Right.
And we just kind of dig a little hole, and we throw the stake underground, and then we pack the snow on top of it and ice it in.
Yep.
And that will, they call it a dead man, I believe.
Yep.
You can stake down on top of snow, no problem, like that. Pitch that teepee, and we've done it so many times on top of snow. Lay out your ground cloth, put your air pad down.
Yep.
You are now camped, no problem. You don't need a floor. You just don't. You're totally good this way. You're totally dry.
Yep.
The ground is cold enough. When you get a stove, when we've been running a stove in those situations, we've done it a couple of different ways, because the stove will melt the snow, and it will like sink into the snow as the stove is going. So we've taken rocks and we've stacked rocks and then put the stove on top of rocks, and
to block that heat.
On my Alaskan trips, we brought a cookie sheet,
right,
which was negligible in the weight. We brought those cookie sheets. We pulled that cookie sheet out, set that on top of the snow, throw the stove in, crank up the heat, and that cookie sheet is unbelievable. It just stays ice cold.
It's enough of a barrier.
It reflects the heat upward. Yep. And that's all the barrier you need. You'd think the cookie sheet would get hot.
Yeah.
It doesn't.
But it doesn't. Right.
I think the cold underneath, combined with the way the heat wants to go up, it just insulates. It does what it needs to do. So that cookie sheet stops the snow from melting. And what you end up with is, around the cookie sheet, the snow sort of sinks a little bit. After like 6 days, you're like 2 feet down.
Right. But the cookie sheet and the stove
sheet, it stays up high. And my stake, my center pole for the center of the teepee, is on the cookie sheet going up into the pole. And it's actually, it gets more and more.
It makes like a giant fortress.
It gets more and more spacious, because as the snow melts, we start carving in like little seats and benches. And now you're in a sunken sort of teepee.
Kind of like an igloo built out of your teepee.
Yes, it's actually pretty sweet.
Right.
And after 5 or 6 days, you might have to reposition a stake or two, but it works incredibly. It's incredibly.
Yeah, and I've done the same thing as far as like the dead man anchors on places that are really, really rocky. I've just put a stake in there. I've twisted it a little bit, and then I've laid the rock to where the stake is like pulling against the couple of rocks that I've put there. So you can do the same thing if you don't have dirt. If
you got rocks around, you can leverage those in various ways to stake down the tent. If you don't, you can just bury that thing in the snow, and smash ice on top of it in snow, and it'll rock in there solid. In fact, it's a little hard to get out.
Yeah, sometimes. Especially that metal that kind of sticks to the base, comes this icicle.
That's why I pretty much never leave anymore without that Petzl pickaxe.
Right.
I use it no matter, all season long. It's 6 ounces, and it's become this super versatile tool for,
especially like you've seen in some of the films in the past, is where a teepee does suck to stake out is on a super steep side hill. But you've seen us where, when it's not frozen, dig down the side hill, you actually have a giant shelter because it gives you more space.
Yep.
But you just dig it out so you're laying flat, but your teepee might be crooked.
We'll take the time to carve out a bench for a teepee to go on a steep slope.
Yep.
And for us, it's a 30-minute job, 40-minute job for setup.
Yep.
But if you're there, especially for days and days,
that's great.
You now have this, castle of comfort for the 30-minute sacrifice of the
It's like
setup.
you can we'll stack logs, we'll stack rocks or whatever on the bottom side where your feet were going to be, and then the dirt we pull off the mountainside,
we've done it,
overlay that.
We've shown it many times.
It's really nice.
In various videos. We'll take the time to get a level, to cut in a level spot on a steep slope. One of the other arguments is, okay, it's just too steep. Well, anywhere I saw, like some of these Hillebergs I see put up, I'm like, that is no bigger of a footprint.
You can't put a Hilleberg up. I promise you this. Like, if you find a place, come at me. But you cannot put a Hilleberg any place that I cannot put a single man floorless shelter. I promise you.
No, absolutely. I don't think there's anyone who really would argue with that from a genuine standpoint.
And I get a stove in that floorless shelter versus the Hilleberg.
That's right. So if you do take a single man floorless shelter and you pick a deer bed, or even a snowy slope, and you create a bench there.
All you need is a little 25-inch wide, 2-foot wide spot for your body to actually lay flat.
And then you can throw in like a medium stove, and that shelter is roasty toasty.
Yes.
The other argument is that we hear, so slopes aren't an issue. Again, we'll throw up our own resume of the hunts we've been on across the world,
right?
And where we put them up. I mean, from the
Alps,
Southern Alps in New Zealand, at the very top of
Rocky Mountains of the West.
Like we've been to the Alaskan, wet wilderness,
right?
Areas, tundra. And the thing about the teepee is, first of all, it's lighter.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't use the stove because you are above timberline 1,000 feet.
Yeah.
You're not above timberline 1,000 feet all 14 days on a 14-day hunt, let's say, or
maybe
10-day hunt.
Days.
You're up there a day or two, and you're always dropping, climbing, dropping. And when you drop, it's like, okay, I'm going to set up on the top of the snow ridge. I'm going to throw out my teepee, and I won't have a stove,
right?
Because there's no wood up there. I'm there for 2 or 3 days. I see my quarry over there. Oh, okay. I'm going to go for it. We drop down. Now we're down in this area where there's timber. There's wood around. There's things I can leverage to heat up, right? As you're now trying to relocate your quarry, like over here, your elk or whatever, your mule deer, sheep, they're all in this corner. You come and you go, just like what I was saying about backcountry BC with Terrence and Doran. They're like, yeah, we're sheep hunting, so leave the tent and the stove. But the tent and stove setup weighs less, so it's not a weight issue.
Right.
The tent and stove has the option of fire. The other one doesn't. Well, that versatility, it turns out they got wet.
Right.
And then we're camped right in a cluster of timber.
Well, and I think
you just eliminated your ability to like steak roasty toasty when you had that opportunity.
And the big argument that you hear people say with take a Hilleberg, it's a double layer shelter, so you don't get the condensation. Well, 99% of the time, that's not an issue. Yes, you're going to get condensation with the teepee or the single man shelter, but it's floorless. But I have that stove to completely dry that out within 10 minutes every morning. Start a fire 15 minutes, start the fire for a minute. I'm putting on a warm pair of boots, and the condensation's gone.
That's no lie. Like, first of all, when you're that high, all the condensation freezes.
Yeah. Right.
When you're in those conditions. Let's say you're on timberline, above timberline on a ridge. We've been there 3-4 days in a row trying to see where our tar are or something like that, or our mule deer. And as you breathe in there, ice gets everywhere. Your bag gets a layer, and there's nothing. There's nowhere for it to go, and it is worse than if you were in a Hilleberg,
for sure.
And And that's going to happen for a day or two or longer, however long you're up there.
Yep.
But when you're actually leveraging the fire, it'll rain in there like the rainforest every morning. Right. Every morning, like, remember?
Mainly because when I get my sleeping bag, I'm too lazy to keep the fire going. So I just sleep, and then we wake up, and it's frozen. You could keep the fire going all night and prevent that.
If you have a fire going, and we actually, with the stove we have now that burns a little more efficient,
right?
You actually can stuff it full of wood and wake up 6 hours, 8 hours later, and it's still putting off enough heat that you didn't really collect a lot of condensation, if any.
Yep.
Some of those places it was negative 15 degrees, and you had to keep that stove cranking.
Right.
And it was a tiny stove, undersized for that time of year.
Yeah, yeah.
So Brad and I were on a hunt. I've been with Lampers similarly, and when you have a bigger stove that's more efficient,
right, burns longer,
you can just stuff it with wood and it'll burn all night. And it'll create those coals, those massive amounts of coals will keep the inside of the teepee warm enough that there's no condensation at all.
Right.
But let's say we do fall asleep. We have a little undersized stove. We went light. It's super cold, colder than we anticipated. Condensation collects. There's an ice layer on the ceiling. We filmed this. We'll start that stove up, and it'll be as if you're in a heavy rainstorm.
Yeah, downpour.
It'll be a little downpour for about 10 minutes. And then about 10 or 15 minutes later, everything is bone dry.
It's dry.
Completely dry.
Yep.
So it's long nights in the wintertime and long days. To be in there with the heat going, like I said, if you want to just keep it going all night, you can. You can take turns. Someone gets up at one time.
In the middle of a hunt, they're like, it's just a suck fest. There's nothing better than just sitting there watching Caveman TV.
Yep.
Like, it's great.
It's so comforting.
It keeps you going. Like on those super hard cold hunts, like there's something about it that will just help you stay out there longer and go harder, push harder.
So the condensation is really manageable.
Yep.
And it's the cost of having that issue is not worth to me leaving the stove behind, especially when you're dealing with sub-zero temperatures. I mean, are you insane? There's no way I'm not running fire. It's just not.
And we have, even in the past, even though we may be above timberline, like if it's 400 yards or 800 yards down.
That's right. I was going to bring that up.
I am going down there, and I'll dump everything in my pack, and I will go down there, and I will load up in firewood.
Yeah, you'll see us on the Eastern Plains or something. And we've talked about being in some regions where it's just Badlands desert kind of stuff. That's just grass as far as you can see. And yet we bring this stove and the teepee because there are little pockets where there's in a little canal, there's a bush that's dead and there's juniper chunks and stuff. We'll bring our little pocket boy saw. We'll be going along and we'll be like, oh, there's wood right there. It's about a mile from camp.
Yep.
Got it. We'll continue our hunt and then we'll go over there on our way back, swing by. We'll grab loads of wood, throw it in our pack, and we'll hike it to our shelter.
Right. You're hoping that you find something closer, but we know that's like our resort, even if it's a mile away. That's our resort for fuel.
Same thing happens in Alaska. Like, oh, there's a really dry log right there. We'll cut that whole dead tree down, and we'll chop it up, and we'll carry it back with us. Me and Brady and Lampers.
Aren't super familiar, like, say you're in even wet terrain, like you're, say, the Northwest or whatever. There's a lot of times, though, on the under canopy of, say, a pine tree or whatever, there's a lot of times, even though it's really wet around, could be raining, snowing, up underneath there, even though there still might be attached to the tree, there's a lot of dead branches you can pull off of that stuff for fuel.
And it's more or less dry because the upper canopy of the tree has sheltered it, and those things aren't laying on the ground. They're stobbing out of the side of the tree trunk. You can cut all that off and get a lot of firewood from a spot like that. Bring the right fire starter, and you can pretty much get some wet stuff to just finally catch.
Correct.
And once you get that fire cranking, it'll dry out all the rest of the wood inside your shelter. And so you just need one solid bonfire going, After that, you're kind of home free. You can get all the other wood to dry out over the course of those days in camp that you have ahead
Especially
of
if
you.
you're staying in that same location. You just continually bring the firewood in, and it just dries out as you're burning that stove throughout the day and night.
So as I watch some hunts where guys go a couple thousand feet above timberline, I'm like, cool. I would actually, if I'm planning on staying there a bit or whatever, I would pack wood.
Yeah. Or
we
one
do
of
that
those,
all the time where it's like, okay, set up camp, blah, blah, blah. We're going to go glass this ridge, and I'm purposely going to drop a little bit so I can grab, 50 pounds of wood and bring it to this location.
Exactly.
So for the next few days, we're totally, totally comfortable and warm. Man, if it's too far, then yeah, we'll just tough it out for a few days with no fire.
Right. Which we have done.
Sometimes it gets so nasty and you're so wet and cold and miserable that you're like, dude, let's drop down to timberline.
Correct.
Set up, dry out, warm up, take it's all stormy, fogged in today. Today's a good day to just go dry out. Do that and then come right back up to the top of the hill and be ready for the next morning.
I swear, like those days where you are socked in and you just sit there with the stove, you rehydrate, you dry out all your stuff, you have like a whole new spark on those next few days of the hunt.
Yeah, so there are no conditions where we're leaving the wood stove shelter combination behind.
Right.
The only time we really do that is when you don't need heat.
Right.
August.
Correct.
September, spring, like May, June. It's like, do I really want to pack a stove when it's this warm? That's it. If it's fall, winter, we just never leave it. If it's early spring, we never leave it. Yep. We always bring the stove.
Especially mountain hunting. You get those squalls that come through and it's like you're wet like that.
It really is a skill. It's bushcraft.
It is.
You've learned to use it. You know the difference between something like a Hilleberg and a floorless wood stove system. You find solutions, and the pros of the wood stove setup just vastly outweigh any sort of benefit that you get from the heavier, non-fire option. Hey, if you like our show and you want to support us, head over to Peaks Equipment and check out what they have. Use the code GRIDDY over there and you will save. They've got the trekking poles. They've got their sleeping bag that they just dropped. Peaks has a Tipi. They have gaiters. They have a headlamp. All premium products for the outdoorsman. Head over there. Use the code GRIDDY. That's peaksequipment.com. Now let's get back to the show.
Even today, or more so today, the bushcraft skills don't have to be near as high because of the quality of fire starter stuff. I mean, that stuff probably kills you.
I mean,
but
you get some trioxane tablets or S-bits.
The new thing I've been running is these little packets. I mean, I just get them off Amazon. It's like a little bottle, a box of 100 of them, and they come in a plastic package. It's like a 1 1/4 by 1 1/4, and then it's just like paper thin. They're super lightweight. They're lighter than S-bit. They take up less room than S-bit, and they burn hotter and longer than S-bit.
Because S-bit burns a long time.
These are like 2 or 3x. Because like sometimes S-bit, if you drop it as you're putting it in the stove,
it goes out.
It goes out. These, I'm like,
but once S-bit goes, it burns a long time.
And that's these. These have like a 3 to 6 minute burn time. It's great because I'm cheating. I don't start out with the little twigs anymore. I just start throwing wood on. And I got this good fire.
That's what I'm saying. Like you could take some wet stuff, and because of the fire starter out there, just let it crank and get that stove going hot.
Yeah.
So another thing that gets brought up is storms. The shelter is not stable enough.
Yeah.
That was important to us. So when we were helping Peaks design the teepee, we wanted to be able to have lots of guy outlines for it, so that we could just pin that thing to the ground. We also wanted the design so that wind could kind of just, wouldn't catch a sail or anything like that.
Right.
The final part of the teepee that mattered to us was the cross trek design in the teepee canopy. We noticed, like, what is it that makes a dome tent so
So
stable
rigid.
in the wind, so rigid. Well, it's got those poles that go from end to end and sort of stiffen up the shelter.
Yep.
So with a pair of trekking poles and going crosswise like an X inside the peak's teepee.
Yep. Going perpendicular to your walls.
Combined with the pole going up the center, being a stout pole, and then all the guy out options, pinning it to the ground.
Yep.
We've thrown it in like intense winds on the top of ridges and saddles and put them through everything that we would put a dome tent through.
Yeah.
And they stayed standing. They withstood the storm. When we were concerned, if we are concerned, sometimes we've taken the extra effort, and I would do this with the dome tent as well.
Yeah.
We've gone ahead and stacked logs and rocks and sticks and stuff around the base of the shelter. So for about 2 feet, we built like a little wall.
Yep.
Maybe even 2.5 feet when we know like a nasty storm is coming. And the reason we wouldn't normally set a tent up there at all.
Right.
It's not an ideal
stay
place
up there for days and days.
It's not an ideal place to camp.
Nope.
The reason that we want that is because that is the spot to find the animals.
Where I can see my glassing vantage.
I can sit there and get maximum glassing opportunity, but it often puts you in a nasty, windy, gross, cold, wet, horrible place to put a shelter.
Right on the mountaintop.
If we wanted to, we could just go boop around the corner 400 yards and be in like a little pocket of calmness and all of that. That's not what we are going for when we're on this hunt. We want to. Yeah. So we've pitched these things in some of the nastiest spots where you're just asking for trouble and then seeing if the tent could take it.
But at the same time, like I can still sit in the teepee and keep the weather off of me. Even though it's nasty, keep it off of me and I can still glass though.
Yeah.
Where if I was 400 yards around the corner, I'm sitting out in the open trying to glass that because I'm glassing it either way. Honestly, that's how you're going to find the animal.
And we have shamelessly run some hot fires in those wood stoves while that stovepipe is just ripping in the wind at the top.
Yep.
I remember being in Alaska with Cole Kramer, and he had a Barney's or Cabela's dome tent, big one, those big heavy ones, because we weren't backpacking. But it had a stove jack in it that I think he had sewn in. And then on the ground, he had a fairly large wood stove, and he brought wood in through on the airplane when it came in.
Right.
Like Presto log type stuff. So we could basically have a shelter with heat in it, cranking and drying things out on the regular because Kodiak is so wet. And that worked well. But there were some windstorms because you're out in this grassy, flat Kodiak land that's just bad. And those windstorms, you thought they were going to rip down everything.
Oh, I bet.
And there were times in that type of storm where Cole, basically pulled the stovepipe out of the stove and then slid it in, to the side because the winds were too heavy.
Yeah.
Now, in the Peaks teepee, with the way we have it guyed out and those cross-trek poles and all of that, and then the way that the Peaks Torrid wood stove locks the pipe into the...
Right. That's the big thing, is it locks it into the flue and then down into the stove itself. And so it
exactly, because one of the things that would happen is with coal is the wind would rip and the whole shelter would sort of move, and that joint between the pipe and the stove itself could tip over or come loose.
Yep.
And now there's fire like coming out the hole and not out the pipe. So when we were messing around with the Torrid, Lampers and I were like, dude, we got to have the pipe lock into the stove base. Also, we need some guy outs on the stove itself. So there's a couple of anchor points where you can tack down the wood stove. So it is locked to the ground. Now your pipe locks into the stove. And now when you get those heavy winds and this tent's sort of withstanding the buffeting of it,
Yep.
and the stovepipe isn't joint. You cut the hole in so it matches the size of your pipe tight.
Right.
Now you're sitting there with a fairly robust system that can withstand the wind and doesn't just like go all over. And I wonder if Cole ran something like that. Now, do we need to drop that pole like we did when he had the big fat pipe that would catch wind and loosen in the top, and the tent would just buckle inward? With the cross trek design on the peaks, it seems to just hold that.
It stays. I mean, like last year I was in, well, year and a half ago now, 2 years ago, I guess. I was in a massive windstorm, snow, late October hunt. And it's probably I was solo. This is the time we were prototyping the Dyneema.
Yeah.
And I have some video of it that just like, you can't see 10 feet in front of you because the wind and the snow.
Yeah.
That was one of those times I was like, should I take it down?
Yeah.
Like, because we have in the past, like, taken a tent pole down, the Tipi pole, and you just hold the fabric over top of you because the wind is so
we
nasty.
did that, you and I.
Yeah, but it was like, no, I guess I'm prototyping it. Let's see if it withstands it.
And that was a different teepee design.
Right.
Now we're dealing with new teepee designs that we help build that are different.
Yep.
You know, it's not the same. I remember running the prototype, like the second prototype of the Peaks teepee with Pedro.
Right.
And we got hit by a storm, and Pedro and I are holding on to the teepee, hoping it didn't like rip off the hillside.
Right.
And he's taking his clothes and he's stuffing them inside his backpack. He's afraid like the wind's going to rip the teepee off and all our stuff is just going to blow off the mountain. And could have. The teepee design had a lot of flaws in it. It was an early prototype, and the pole had broken also.
Right.
Because the pole wasn't designed well.
Like, how small of carbon fiber can we get away with?
Dude, it was too small. And when you tighten the teepee down, the pole buckled.
Right.
And then it was like super bent, but you needed it tight, so that it would withstand a storm. And then it snapped that pole. So we had this janky rigged system where I had stacked rocks up to get the pole to make up for the broken piece of the pole. And then I had to duct tape and double up the pole at the bottom so it wouldn't snap. It was just that's what happens when you test gear in real life situations. You think you got it, you go out, you use it. Nope, don't got it. And that's
back to the drawing board.
That's how this gear gets built and gets updated, and often from gaiters to poles to stoves and everything. I know people want to rush out, sleeping bag, and buy the very first one that comes out, and it's good.
Right.
We've tested it. But on year 3, 4, and 5 of that product being out, they're not the same because we learn through vast people using it and over time.
Right.
But I'd say Peaks vets the gear at a scale that most companies aren't.
It's crazy because most stuff that Peaks comes out with is like a 1.5 to 3 year project. I mean, like
there's not very many SKUs, not very many products at Peaks.
But when they do come out, you know that you have a good product that withstands the weather and the tests that it's been put up against.
There's things I wanted in earlier versions of teepees that I wanted put in, and they just didn't get done.
Yep.
And so to be able to somebody might say, it's not, it doesn't fit my need. And I'm not here to like, if a guy wants to hunt with an MSR hubba, like Ryan did for 20 years, every time he sees a Hilleberg, he's like, yeah, that reminds me of 1990s, early 2000s. I've graduated from that way of life. How many mountaintops he's been on in a dome tent? Those days are over. They're dead to us. The only way to like know though is to live in it. I remember, and there's people stubborn. Like, there just are, and there are people who are just like, it's too much hassle. I don't want to deal with it. So be it. I don't see it as any increased workload. When we were going to Alaska, remember when you and I got invited to do a budget grizzly bear hunt.
Yep.
Not giant grizzlies. Come on up here, pay just a little bit, and let's experiment. We've never killed bears. We're going to see if we can do
new
it.
Area.
Come up here. That's a win-win. I get to go up there, have an adventure in Alaska. You don't know what you're doing. Let's see. Let's learn together. We went up there. We met with Chris Tobias, and he's a friend of ours in Alaska, and he was our guide on that trip. And Chris had not used a wood stove.
Yep.
And teepee for
the conversation basically went down.
I think he owned a teepee, but he had never like really done the stove thing, or he had done it once, but no, I don't think he had ever done it.
I don't think he had, because I remember like the conversation went as we were putting out our gear and figuring out what we were packing, who was packing what. He was like, "You don't need the stove and the teepee. Just leave the stove."
So did Eric.
And
Eric was like, "We don't need that."
Eric. And we looked at each other and we're like,
"Yeah, we ain't
2
leaving.
pounds, I'm taking that stove. Like, we will pack it."
Yeah, you're smoking crack, dude. I ain't going into Alaskan wilderness.
First morning. So we stayed that night, and the first morning it had snowed on us. Like, just a skip.
It was cold.
But it was cold.
Below freezing.
Yep. And we had a wood stove, and Chris was like, "Dude, this is great. Like, this is awesome." And the whole time we were like, "Yep, should have left it, right?"
Yeah.
No.
And throughout the course of the week, there were a few days where the stove was never used. It stayed in your bag.
Right.
And then there were days where we lived by that stove because we got soaked and we dried out, or it was cold.
Yeah.
So after that, Chris was a believer, like all in, full hearted,
every hunt.
And now, and like we went back up there. He's like, he's got his own massive. He's got a dial,
right?
And then,
and again, this is all in Alaska. And it's wet.
There were so many years where he sheep hunted, did some doll, did this and that, and he was rocking the old school like Hilleberg stuff, and now he's so empowered. And there ain't no way he's going back.
No.
When Ryan and I met him and we did the float together out there, Chris, I love going with Chris now because he's a fire king. And he got a bigger teepee. He got a cot because we're floating.
Yep.
And he got a massive Big Mama stove. So we weren't messing around. And we would find spots to pitch it. Took a little bit of time,
right? But
we'd find a spot, we'd get it dialed in, and we'd set up that thing, and we were living like kings. And it's funny to see, just that's what happens.
The evolution.
You go with somebody who truly, has mastered the teepee wood stove like techniques for all conditions, all the different places. And you bring someone who's virgin to it, who's never done it, they leave with a whole new mindset for what's possible.
Yeah.
And they don't go back. I don't know anybody who's like, I just, the fire thing. Yeah, I'm not about it.
Perfect example. My dad is like, as he's gotten older, I remember we used to always, it was like this little green dome style type tent that we'd packed. It was like 6.5 pounds. Yeah, only 3 guys can sleep in it, and you have no stove, and it sucked. And the last few years now, he's like, nope, never am I not going without a stove and teepee, even on a solo hunt. It's still lighter than packing that same tent.
And I am shiver at the idea of some of the 10 to 14-day hunts I've done, where all I had was a dome tent. I remember being at Prince of Wales Island, and it rained like 12 out of the 14 days.
Yeah.
And we had no way to do fire, unless we did it under a tree somewhere. Yeah. And even then,
it doesn't produce the same heat, and it's just so hard to dry stuff out. Like, what happens is most time you end up burning your gear because you get sparks on it.
Yeah,
embers.
And I remember, those days. I remember a hunt I was on above 10,000 feet, and I was up there 10 days, and it snowed and it hailed and it rained, and we got drenched on one hike back. And I did that stupid Sitka rewarming drill with Barklow where I was drenched to the bone. I had no other change of clothes, no fire, no nothing. I crawled. This is 2016. I crawled inside my sleeping bag, soaking wet, try to dry out. Couldn't. Like, it just was not drying. And took off the wet clothes and just put them off to the side. Finally got my core warmth back. But now my clothes are in a pile that's just drenched. I squeeze the water out best I can and try to do that. Then I bring one layer in at a time. My pants first, and and it's miserable. I try to sleep with soaking wet pants on, trying to dry them out. I'm at like 11 or 12,000 feet, and it's not letting up anytime soon.
Yeah.
And eventually, we basically grab our clothes, soaking wet, put them on. It was miserable. And we're freezing. And we hike below timberline and we go into a thicket of trees. We grab and we build the biggest bonfire ever seen in the wilderness. And then we're burning our clothes, like you said. Mm-hmm. Can't get your boots dry. You're standing there trying to get clothes dry, and they either burn or stay wet.
Right.
You know, the whole thing is that perfect example of the old way of doing it. And I cringe today when I think about how many days of just gradual moisture and cold, everything I owned soaked in. Mm-hmm. Like itty bitty by itty bitty, day after day after day.
Right.
When we were in the Southern Alps, dude, I've never been so wet. Never been so wet. And my sleeping bag got drenched, and we didn't have we left our wood stove on this one section of the hunt because we're like, we don't need it. We're just going to use the shelter, blah, blah, blah. Big, massive, colossal, retarded mistake that we made. This was early, and we ended up, Lampers and I, making this heroic sojourn to this hut that was way far away. Dude, we got that hut, and we got that fire going. And I remember going, I'm never going to go out without a wood stove.
Yeah.
Here I am carrying the teepee, but ditch the stove. What? So I could save 2 pounds?
Right.
And then borderline killed myself for the next week. So I cringe. I cringe when I think about the misery that I suffered. And I've seen people talk about, staying warm and so forth. And the truth is, without fire and a stove, you're sort of fighting an uphill battle the whole time. That is the key ingredient.
Yeah.
That's the part that gets your bag dry when it wants to be wet.
Right.
That's the part that gets your boots dry
down jacket
when they go wet. When you sweat too much, that's the fire is what gets that dry. Like, man, all of it combines. And without the stove, you're lost.
Yep.
It's just not the same thing. And I look now at how much I do not dread these adventures because we're so freaking comfortable.
Right. And what my favorite thing is when I'm like high mountain, got the stove, the teepee, and I don't have to pack water because there's snow there and I can use the stove to melt that because water is heavy.
Not using gas,
right?
Using wood. There's something about being able to cook up boiling water, cook up your food, your meals. Let's say your little stove runs out of gas.
Yep.
There's a lot. The stove makes life
like
versatile.
3 liters of water, 6 or 7 pounds.
And there's not a weight penalty.
Mm-mm.
When you compare it to the shelters that are used for those late season mountain hunts, there's not a weight penalty.
No, not at all. It's well worth it.
That's just where we're coming from. I mean, everybody can do what they want. The same thing we had with a broadhead discussion the other day. It's like, use what arrow and broadhead and like setup you want to use. I'm just telling you from my experience where I'm at, and you can take it or leave it. Be offended, don't be offended. It's just where I stand. I even called Ryan and I'm like, can you think of any scenario? And he's like, no, he loves fire just like the rest of us.
Yep.
He's like, no, I'll find a way to make it work and use it. And it just makes sense.
Yeah.
Just makes sense. Last year, we did a couple of seminar events that were like 2.5, 3-day weekend events. We're doing those again this year. We're going to 4 different Shields locations, and we're going to do a seminar. Myself, Ryan Lampers, and Mark Livesay. One of them is a bear tour event.
Boise, Idaho.
The other 3 are elk related. Yep. So if you want to come to those events, they're in 4 different states.
Idaho, Montana, Colorado, and Texas.
There you go. To learn about it, we're calling it the Peaks Tour. Go to treelineacademy.net. Go over there, look up the Peaks Tour information there. You can sign up, come join us. Like I said, it's myself, Ryan Lampers, Mark Livesay. We're going to be at each of those events. Come, learn, and ask us questions. It was a hit last year when we did it, so I think you're going to enjoy this one. It's a fun multi-day event, and hope to see you there. Go to treelineacademy.net and look up the Peaks Tour. I hope you found it useful. Let us know what you think in the comments on the YouTube channel. We're happy to hear it. I'd like to know what other people's experiences are.
Right.
I'm still going to make that little movie. 5 minutes long.
I think it'd be great.
It's going to have like probably, 200 camping spots. And it's going to show like all
the build up of
16
logs
years
around it and rocks.
I mean, you're talking about the first teepees I used was 2016. Really, with fire to 2025.
Right.
It's a 9-year run now.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of this stuff has come a long way since the beginning.
Absolutely.
And you look at it now and it's like, dude, we have such great gear nowadays.
Yeah.
Such great gear. Weight to
a little bit of food, a little bit of water, and I could spend $365 on the mountain. I'm telling you. So comfortable.
In Alaska, we brought fishing pole and
I bring my
heat
on certain spring hunts and stuff. I know there's river. I bring my 10-car fly rod all the time.
Yeah,
it's less than a pound.
The thing about it is,
and it collapses to like this big.
You get left behind out there on some of those. I feel like that's okay.
Yeah,
we got blueberries and fish, and we could live here for another month.
Oh man.
So if you kill a moose, you're there. You should live for 6 months. So anyway. I hope you got something out of it. Thanks for tuning in again, and let us know what you think in the comments, and we'll catch you in the next episode. Stay gritty.